has to be harmonised with an appropriate planning framework.
Turning now to Sue Pritchard, really interesting reading about in our pack the way that you can use agroecology to work sort of in a number of ways hand in hand with nature in other different ways to apply ecological concepts to farming, which I think our select committee would find particularly interesting. So the Food and Farming and Countryside Commission do advocate a shift to moving in that direction to increase the resilience and the sustainability of farming. Can you just sort of give some of the benefits that you would see across the industry by moving into that realm?
Yes. Well, and first of all, I just want to perhaps clarify a definition of agroecology, because not everybody...
That's really useful for people who are not in the room and watching around the country.
Yes, not everybody's familiar with it, but actually there's no mystery to agroecology at all. It's simply the name that's given to the body of work that is coalescing around fairer, more sustainable food systems, and importantly aligned towards progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not just about what happens on the farm, it's about the whole of the food system. It's and one of my colleagues, a farmer in Oxfordshire, calls it the bookshelf on which many other tomes sit, things like regenerative agriculture, organics, nature-friendly farming, but also economics and governance and culture. And those latter terms are probably more familiar to all of you. So regenerative agriculture, organics, nature-friendly farming all form part of the movement towards agroecology. We commissioned some research back in 2019-2020, looking at the prospects of a transition to agroecology in the UK and the kinds of benefits we might see if that were both agronomically and economically plausible. And thankfully, having spent the money on the research, that it confirmed that indeed it is. And moreover, it helps us to tackle several crises simultaneously. So a transition to agroecological practices will reduce emissions by upwards of 70%. It will restore biodiversity across the whole of the farmed landscape. It keeps food production at the core of land management, ensuring that we grow more of the healthy food sustainably that we need to be eating more of. It ensures that we don't export our environment impact, questions that you've just asked. And it supports greater food security through supporting viable farm businesses. Now, multiple other reports share that conclusion since we produced ours, from the Sustainable Food Trust, in Feeding Britain, from Nature Friendly Farmers, in the Farming for Climate Action. But perhaps most relevant to this inquiry, the Climate Change Committee commissioned a rapid review on agroecology, which was published just last month. And it says, by applying agroecological practices, farmers do more than just produce food. They also protect biodiversity and associated ecosystem services. And in addition, the development of regional markets based on localised food production and consumption ensures a decent livelihood for small-scale farmers and fair food prices for consumers. And this in turn makes farming economically more competitive and more resilient to global contingencies, supporting a fairer transition to net zero. So that was the Climate Change Committee's comments then. And in addition, in their adaptation progress report, so we're talking about resilience and adaptation now in this context, and the role that agroecology has in both resilience and adaptive practices, it in fact recommends agroecology as the key enabler to sustainable and climate resilient working land and seas. But it does say that agroecology needs much more R&D, much more investment in R&D and technologies, and indeed funding support. Now we recognise that this is not without controversy. We also commissioned a Chatham House report written by Professor Tim Benton and Helen Harwatt to scrutinise some of the assumptions that we knew we were making about the benefits of agroecology and testing those against assumptions that others make about other versions, if you like, of sustainable intensification. And Tim and Helen conclude that this is no longer about the science. This is no longer about justifying the scientific arguments for agroecology. They are now fairly well made. But it is about values-based ideas. It's about the role of markets. It's about the role of the state in making decisions, about intervention in food systems, and it's also about dietary change. And I think we probably will come on to that, won't we, at some point. So it's those other values-based issues that are just as important as the science, the agronomy, as the economics, in thinking about a transition to agroecology across the whole food system.
I'm sorry, but if we have a hard stop at 5, we're going to have slightly snappier answers well as questions. Duncan.
Okay. Just moving to Chris Brown. We know last year extraordinary temperatures, which may not be extraordinary going forward by all the forecasts, and 40-degree temperatures. You commented on once before in one of our meetings about the malfunctions of some of your supply chain, refrigeration, etc., with ASDA, with those high temperatures. I mean, we've seen that happen across the whole of the country in all different spheres. We had ambulances not being able to cope with running their air conditioning and breaking down. So we've seen it all over the country, different areas. I mean, how are you adapting the business to be able to cope with in terms of your supply chains when we see these abnormal temperatures?
Well, having to react to it, to be fair. So yeah, 40-degree temperatures were none of our design specifications. For the most part, a lot of our refrigeration is mid-30s maximum. Also the same on many farming systems as well. I've never seen so many fans going into dairy farms as has happened over the past 12 months. It's also that climatic change had a couple of other effects, so it's harder to get water, and Minette already said, so there's probably a switch of potato production further north into Scotland. And we never talk about it, but we're still an island, and it makes a difference the seas warming up. So mackerel, which is a major consumption in the UK market, and actually much appreciated globally, it's a straddling stock, so they straddle different fishing management, and they've moved further north, so they've gone in further north towards Iceland. We, along with others, have formed an advocacy group. There are 90 retailers, and including our global markets for those mackerel, to advocate on behalf of the mackerel, I have to say, with governments, and ask for better control and management. So we're having to respond to food sourcing as we see climate change having an impact.
Great. And Minette, snappy, but I know this is something that's really, really important. We've touched on it before. The government's new plan for water, is that taking enough action to help and support farmers through droughts? We saw what happened last year. We talked already about the eastern part of the country and just how short their supplies of water. Abstraction licences are being taken away from so many people in the eastern part of the country. Are we doing enough in that plan for water?
I think the short answer is no. We have to have the ability to be able to store water on farm. Planning permission, you talked about the importance of a flexible planning framework. That is key to all of this. I mentioned earlier about building bridges. Abstraction is becoming more difficult, so we have to have more on-farm water storage that is accessible. So, planning needs to be aligned. I think the challenge of only looking at abstraction through the environmental lens has also been incredibly prohibitive. We should be taking a wider look.
I completely agree with you. We've had huge issues. People don't seem to realise it is 2 years for a reservoir, 1 year to get through planning, and then everyone forgets you've got to fill the thing. Absolutely. Well, that takes a year.
Yep. So no, it's not joined up enough, and I think we will reach with the challenges of climate change and weather events. We will probably need to look at greater changes than being able to store water on farms in reservoirs. It's going to need, real serious infrastructure if we are going to move it around the country in the way that is needed. But I think it is now being acknowledged, and certainly by the Secretary of State, that water security is something that really does matter to this country.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm just going to ask a few quick questions on water pollution, as I've got you all here. Minette, you know our committee did a lot of work in this area, mostly focused on the pollution coming from sewage from humans rather than from animals, but the farm sector accounts for a similar amount of pollution incidents. What has the farming industry done of their own bat to try to help to recognise that problem needs solving?
Well, I think all farmers absolutely recognise that as much as we want high quality soil health, we want really good water quality. I think we really do need to look at making sure that with the public monies for public goods, that all our watercourses are incentivised to have grass buffer strips. There is disparity effectively between arable land and grassland at the moment on the payment rates. We want to make sure that ideally you've got the same value on grassland as you have on arable land with a buffer strip. I know many arable farmers are frustrated that the slurry investment grant is only focused on dairy farmers. There is a great opportunity to actually be taking nitrates and phosphates away from watercourses and dairy businesses onto arable land, which is very much needed, and actually that is a big part of resource use efficiency, delivering for net zero. So I think everybody is in farming really joined up on wanting to provide the solutions. And as I say, in all the work we've done with our water management strategy, we feel that we've put forward a lot of proposals as to what this could look like, because it really does matter that we sort it out.
Can you make sure we have sight of those as part of this inquiry? That would be very helpful. Sue, can I turn to you in relation to the River Wye in particular, given that you're I'm not sure if you farm in that catchment, but you'll be very familiar with the pressures from poultry units on the Wye specifically. Do you think there are opportunities for poultry farmers to manage their equivalent of slurry, their litter, in a way that will sort of allow the problems on the Wye to be resolved, or are we ultimately going to have to reduce the volume of processing and growth of poultry in that catchment?
Both, actually. The comment that Minette made earlier about moving nutrients from parts of the country where we have too many of them to parts where we need a lot more of them is a point very well made. One of the strategies that's being suggested for the Wye at the moment is anaerobic digesters. I'm very unconvinced by that at the moment. Elsewhere in Wales, we have huge issues with pollution from anaerobic digesters, damaging rivers irreparably at times. But there are some really interesting new technologies.
Is that from the residues being spread on the land at the wrong time?
Leaks in watercourses.
Right.
So a couple of things I think become important. It is really important that the Environment Agency and the other regulatory bodies really do take up their responsibilities to follow through on existing regulations. DEFRA's advice to the EA at the moment to operate on an advice-led basis rather than prosecuting, I think is misplaced, and you may well know already, Chair, that River Action and other bodies are starting to pursue legal action now, or invited a judicial review on that particular decision. But there is some good news. There are some of the technological innovation around manure management, nutrient management, showing small digesters that can be located on farms where litter goes in at one end and out the other end comes a very saleable product that is easily transported to other parts of the country. So there are economic opportunities for farmers to make better use of the excess nutrients they have. Are they being supported through the ELM scheme or the SFI scheme? Not at this stage.
Yet. Peter, can I just come to you on the dairy? So Minette mentioned slurry. There have been some quite well publicised dairy problems. I'm thinking particularly the Dairy Crest issue at Davidstow, where there has been a significant fine imposed, and I think further action may follow. I don't ask you to comment on that specifically, but are the measures that the government is encouraging with the extra funding for slurry going to be enough? Are farmers, dairy farmers in particular, aware of this problem and their role in it, and are they determined to do something about it?
I think they're very much aware of the challenge that they face and the importance of the slurry infrastructure grant. I think there's a very high level of demand, and I think what we'd like to see is a commitment by the government to repeat that programme with possibly a higher level of funding. Because I think, as I've pointed out earlier, there is a backlog of investment in that area, but the whole sector is aware of it, and I think people would like to see it.
Are the processors willing to help co-invest with their suppliers?
No, it is not something that I think processors are considering. They have their own challenges and their own investment requirements, so I think it's a challenge that's falling very much on dairy farmers, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I'm trying to be exemplary and speeding up, so I'm going to ask Sherilyn now. You've got 6 minutes.
Fine. Okay, I'll do my best. Sue, if I can start with you, I'm going to talk a little bit about the change in diet, if I can. Henry Dimbleby's report concluded that substantial shifts in the nation's diet are required if we are to reduce the environmental and health impacts on consumption, and obviously the tilt on that is a move away from meat and dairy. I just wondered if you could comment on that and whether you think sustainability in our food and farming system can be achieved if we see that change in diets.
Change in diets is essential. I know many people argue that that is an impossible task and are seeking to imagine changes without diet change. But the reality is that diets have already changed dramatically in the last 40 years. I know public health say they find it hard to change diets to more healthy eating, but industry doesn't find it hard at all. And one of the reasons is that for every £5 that's spent on public health education, the industry is spending £200 marketing unhealthy junk food. So it is really important that government takes sets the right guardrails for industry to change their current practices and to direct move towards more healthy diets. Now, this isn't just us saying that. Just recently, the People's Plan for Nature, a citizens' assembly commissioned by the RSPB, WWF and the National Trust, published its review, which had several chapters on food and farming. And in that report, citizens were calling for a national conversation about food, arguing that all retailers and all food processors must be absolutely transparent about the sustainability of the whole supply chain, from climate, nature and health and well-being. Producers should just stop producing food with negative impacts on nature, on climate and health. And they want to see government putting policies in place which will enable more people to reduce their consumption of intensive meat and dairy and fish. But so they see that this is a structural issue. This isn't an issue where individuals, as Henry said earlier, this is not a decision that consumers can be making on a busy Friday night when you're running around the supermarket and trying to make choices about what you choose and how. This is a structural issue which Henry describes really eloquently in the National Food Strategy, that requires upstream interventions from government, placing the responsibility on businesses to create the right healthy food environment for citizens.
Peter, I wonder if you could respond to that actually, and let the committee know about any unintended consequences, and also if you could let us know how the dairy industry is already responding to that sort of call.
Well, I think we would reject any argument that somehow you'd improve the nation's health by moving away from dairy. All the most recent available research indicates that dairy as part of a balanced diet has a positive effect on health. I think the idea that somehow dairy consumption is associated with negative effects is based on some very outdated nutritional thinking, which doesn't bear real further scrutiny. In terms of you'd achieve beneficial environmental impact from cutting dairy, I think just building on the point that Chris made earlier, that because dairy and methane production is part of a natural cycle, the issue is the stock of methane the dairy industry sustains in the atmosphere. And as long as we're improving efficiency or marginally reducing the production of methane, then we are contributing to global cooling. And there are a few other sectors who can make that claim, and other parts of the economy like transport or aviation. So we are already making a positive contribution towards global cooling. And in terms of whether or not you'd actually achieve any desirable impact or whatever your objective is in terms of production, changing consumption may have no impact on that whatsoever. Because currently we're getting strong messages from government that we should increase dairy exports. So if there's a fall in domestic consumption, the processing sector may just redirect its output towards towards export markets without any change being communicated down the supply chain to dairy farmers. So as a means of trying to achieve a specific environmental objective, changing consumption, given you're going through the various steps of the supply chain, is not, I would have thought, actually a rational policy, because you can't be confident you're delivering the effect that you're seeking.
And
2 minutes left.
In which case, sorry, Minette, I'm going to jump straight to Chris. I wonder, Chris, can I ask you a two-part question, if I can? One, responding to that debate, has your sector seen a reduction in consumption demand for dairy and meat? And secondly, declaring an interest as a Cornish fishwife, you spoke about the fish earlier. Could I ask you to comment on the responsibility or what interaction you and other supermarkets have in the eating habits of the consumer? So we know that the quotas will be changing every year depending on which species is plentiful and which isn't. So what more can supermarkets do to get consumers to eat fish that they're not already eating, which might seem quite unusual? If you put them out there with recipes on TV and all the rest of it, you can change people's habits. You're more powerful than I think you realise. So I wondered if you could first comment on spending habits and then on that particular point.
I agree with Peter fundamentally, and very often these things are proposed but without any consequences actually being explored. So nothing is without consequence, and I think there's a broader, better debate which needs to be balanced by looking at and examining that. Going to your fish point, I hesitate to say that we're not that powerful. I failed to persuade people to consume bubblegum flavoured milk. So fish species, unfortunately, as you know, are the big five, and they're the ones that they recognise and enjoy. I think that's a really uphill task.
Okay.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you very much. And Matthew Offord.
I wanted to ask Mr. Pritchard about the government's land use framework, and in what areas do you see that trade-offs will need to be balanced in order for that to work?
I think it's less about trade-offs and more about optimising multifunctionality. Henry was very generous in describing the work that we've been doing for the last 5 years now, and just reminding the committee that the reason that we're doing the work is because a very broad cross-sector of interests recognised that it was time, that we could not put off facing into the need for a comprehensive land use framework any longer, given all of the pressures on land that Minette summed up earlier too. We talk about a land use framework as much as a process, a set of principles and processes for better quality decision making. We tend to resist some of the other interpretations of a land use framework, which perhaps, as Henry said earlier, assumes that somebody will be sitting in some kind of central spot and directing how land will be used around the country. We don't think that's a very good idea at all. But we do think it is critically important to bring all of the different interests together. We talk about land for climate mitigation, nature recovery, rural housing, energy, transport infrastructure, but of course also food security. And there are no processes that exist at the moment that bring all of those actors together to mediate, negotiate how we make decisions about land and land use. So we have been running 2 pilots. We've been running 2 pilots in Devon and in Cambridgeshire on a county scale, bringing together all of the key players in both of those places. And we've just published in the last couple of weeks some of the emerging findings from that work. What we have found is that a land use decision-making framework helps provide a roadmap which does bring leaders together to define and to debate and to deliver the kind of strategic goals, translating national priorities into how they're going to work in a local place for land. So it joins up the planning framework with other land use decision-making so that it is truly useful. Better use of data is absolutely vital. One of our partners in this work is the Geospatial Commission, who've been working with us in both places as well as in their own pilots, looking how we can use existing data, bring it together really effectively for better quality decisions. It absolutely should not be top down, but not just bottom up either. It's an integrating process. Effective public engagement is key. So many really important decisions get kicked into the long grass or just put off because institutions are very anxious about public reaction. But we have found that citizens really do want to be involved in those decisions, providing they're involved early enough to be able to shape the process and make a contribution. And landowners, I'll just make quickly this last point because it's about landowners. So landowners really value the opportunity to participate in a process from which they have previously been excluded. They've not been invited. Institutions are often invited, but landowners, land managers are not. Sorry.
But do you share some of the concerns that the government may abuse this process, for example, by seeking to produce bioenergy crops, simply for the expense of certain other sectors, such as the aviation industry, who are not going to cut their carbon emissions? And so this is a way that the government can actually skew the process.
Yes, I think that is a good question. But if a land use framework is inclusive and transparent and open, those decisions won't be made behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. Those trade-offs, those conversations will be clear and open to scrutiny, and therefore required to be accountable for those decisions.
That's great. Ms Batters, environmental land management schemes, what concerns do you have about them?
Gosh, what concerns and where to start in the time available?
You have 2 minutes.
Look, I think it's tailored towards the environment. There's nothing wrong with that at all, but it needs to... We've got legislated pathways now, net zero, clean air, clean water. Food production has to be part of this, and I don't feel it is yet. It's not to say that it can't be, there's still time, but it's not there yet. And the other point I'd add that I think has been the hardest point for us at the NFU to land is how do we deal with risk and volatility? You know, the point last summer about BPS payments being paid, half of them up front, was because there were serious concerns about how people would feed their livestock. If we are going to continue with a policy totally predicated on the income forgone model, i.e. you do stuff and you get paid for doing stuff, how do we manage risk? How do we manage the challenges of climate change without, really diverse side effects from that way of thinking? So income forgone is the biggest challenge within the current thinking of ELMS, and it needs to change.
You've also said that the sustainable farming incentive has to work, and so where would you like to see changes there to make sure that it does work for farmers?
So on the arable side of things, I think it has improved a lot, and I think we have very much been listened to. I think now you've got a story of two halves, though. You've got, for the arable side, something that effectively is working, and farmers can reclaim back what they lost in BPS. On the grassland side, both for upland and lowland, you've got much lower payment rates. It doesn't look like low input grassland is being valued at all. For instance, you've got a £98 per hectare payment for low input grassland. For arable conversion, you get a £220 per acre payment, so that's nearly £400 per hectare. Huge disparity between the two. The livestock sector massively impacted by trade deals, potentially fairly quickly. So we've got to have equality, I would say, in the first instance across grassland and arable land, and potentially incentivising production. Huge challenges now within the horticultural sector. We should be producing more. Big issues for potatoes. So how do we have a scheme that actually works for those sectors that have not been part of the previous CAP thinking in this country?
Okay, and just very quickly to open it up to the other members of the panel, I want to ask you, what recommendations do you think that this committee, the report that we produce, that we could make to the government to ensure the resilience and sustainability of the food and farming system in this country?
Government needs to take food seriously. It's absolutely central to all of our lives, and yet the way food is produced is deeply implicated in the crises we're also having to manage: the climate crisis, the nature crisis, the health crisis. I think it's a false distinction that we have to choose between food security and tackling those crises. So I would say we need a well-resourced transition plan across all government departments, actually, which is directed towards producing a more sustainable food system based on agroecology, I would argue, and which gives farmers the right signals and the right resources to deliver both food production and climate nature adaptation. And we need a level playing field for business. Paul Polman will say it has to be good business to do the right thing for climate, for nature and health. And I think good businesses want clear, lined up legislation to support their development.
Dairy industry.
Quickly for dairy, I think given we're a market-driven industry exposed to international competitive pressure, as I said, we'd like to see continued support to help innovation at farm level to improve efficiency and competitiveness. We'd like to see help in meeting regulatory compliance costs. I think it would be helpful if the government acknowledged what the industry itself is doing in terms of improving its environmental performance, particularly through the dairy roadmap. I think also a recognition that in the end for the dairy sector, you're talking about 8,000 dairy farmers. They're all in their own particular point in their career cycle. They all have their own particular farm, their own circumstances, their own set of responsibilities, the resources available to them. So they have to be recognised that they have to find a way of bringing them on board if they do want to achieve a degree of change, and give them the tools in order to achieve the objectives that they're seeking. And if you speak to those organisations that have a challenge of trying to change farming behaviour, it's a very complex and challenging issue, so it has to be informed by a degree of social science. It can't be, as Henry Dimbleby referred to earlier, just purely science driven. You need to take people into account in all of this.
Thank you. I'm afraid you might not have quite finished, Matthew, but I know some people have got to go, so including me. So I'm going to call that to a halt. Thank you very much indeed to our panellists, Sue Pritchard, Peter Dawson, Chris Brown and Minette Batters. Thank you for your time, and I apologise for the interrupted session that we've had. It's been very valuable.
Yeah.